When the HOA tried to bulldoze my family's land for their luxury resort, they had no idea I'd spent months laying the perfect trap. They took my bait. Hook, line, and sinker. But how did I turn their own greed into the sweetest victory our neighborhood had ever seen? The paper cut from the official HOA letter stung my finger as I stood at my mailbox. But what hurt more were the words inside. After review of community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property. I read it twice, my hands shaking. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. I marched straight to Eleanor Winters' house. Our new HOA president with her perfect garden and even more perfect smile. She answered the door in workout clothes, not even trying to hide her annoyance. "Can I help you, David? This letter says you're taking my land. There must be some mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "No mistake. Our professional survey shows your grandfather's hand-drawn maps were incorrect. The board voted unanimously last night. Without telling me? I've been paying taxes on that land for 15 years. She examined her manicured nails. The HOA bylaws don't require notification for property corrections. We're planning a wonderful resort-style pool there. Everyone will benefit. Even you." I was about to argue when music exploded from next door, the Morgan's yard. Eleanor's smile turned genuine. "I should go. Tyler and Samantha are hosting the neighborhood welcome party. You should come. It might help you adjust to the changes." Walking home, the music grew louder. Through the fence, I could see my neighbors Tyler and Samantha with their friends, laughing by their brand new pool, built suspiciously close to our property line. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bass thumped until 1 a.m. I tried calling Tyler twice. No answer. At 1:15, I knocked on their door. Tyler answered, red-faced and holding a beer. "Hey man, party's over. What's up?" "It's almost 1:30. Some of us work tomorrow." Samantha appeared behind him. "We stopped the music right at 1. Check the bylaws. The noise is still." "Look, Tyler cut me off." Eleanor said we're good until 1. "Not our problem if you can hear people talking." I took a deep breath. Speaking of Eleanor, did you know about this HOA plan for my back acre? Their guilty looks told me everything. "You did. You knew they were stealing my land." "Not stealing," Samantha corrected. "Reallocating. The resort will have a lap pool for serious swimmers, cabanas, a cocktail bar. On my property." Tyler shrugged. "It's not personal. Eleanor showed us the real property lines. Your grandfather's maps were wrong." Back home, I couldn't sleep. I dug out Grandpa's old wooden chest from the attic. Inside were the original property documents, yellowed with age. I spread them on the kitchen table under the lamp, comparing them to the modern survey Eleanor had attached to her letter. Something wasn't right. Grandpa's boundaries followed natural landmarks, the creek, the old oak tree, the rocky ridge. The HOA map ignored these completely, drawing straight lines that conveniently cut off my most beautiful acre. I noticed small writing in the corner of Grandpa's deed that I'd never paid attention to before. It referenced county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed, a plan began forming in my mind. I'd need help, though. I scrolled through my phone contacts until I found James Jacobson, a surveyor who'd worked with my father years ago. I texted him even though it was 3 a.m. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the county records office. My cousin Vince worked there, and I needed access to the original surveys. "These HOA people," Vince muttered as we dug through dusty files. "They're getting bolder every year." "Ah, here it is." The 1952 survey clearly showed my property extended beyond what even I had thought. The creek had moved after a flood in the 70s, but property lines didn't move with it. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Community announcement. Groundbreaking for Pinecrest Resort begins Tuesday. Please clear any personal items from the designated area." Tuesday. That gave me 5 days. On my way home, I drove past the Morgan house. Workers were setting up an even bigger speaker system by their pool. Tyler waved cheerfully as I passed. That afternoon, Jacobson arrived with his equipment. Let's find those original markers, he said. If they're still there, the HOA has a big problem. We worked until sunset, careful to stay out of sight. Behind my shed, under years of overgrown grass, Jacobson's metal detector found the first marker. His eyebrows shot up. According to this, your property extends another 50 feet that way, which includes part of the Morgan's new pool. We found 3 more markers before dark. Each confirmed what Grandpa's maps showed. My land was actually larger than what I'd been maintaining. There's more, Jacobson said quietly. See this ridge? The geological survey from the 50s notes it as a potential archaeological site. Native American artifacts were found here in the 40s. I remembered Grandpa's stories about arrowheads and pottery shards. I thought they were just tales. What does that mean legally? If confirmed, it could trigger a historical preservation review. No development allowed. That night, another party started next door. This time, I smiled as the music blared. Let them enjoy it while they could. My doorbell rang around 8 p.m. Rose Thompson, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street, stood there with a casserole. Thought you might need some dinner with all that commotion next door, she said. I invited her in and found myself telling her everything. Rose listened carefully, then said, Eleanor's been pulling these tricks for years. She forced the Hendersons out last summer with fake violations. Their house is now her daughter's. Why doesn't anyone stop her? Fear. She's friends with the mayor's wife. But, Rose's eyes twinkled. I taught high school history for 40 years and volunteered at the county museum. I know a thing or two about archaeological preservation. As Rose left, she paused at the door. This land means something to you, doesn't it? Beyond just property value. I thought about Grandpa teaching me to fish in the creek. Dad building my treehouse on the old oak. It's my history. Then fight for it, she said simply. In bed that night, my phone lit up with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Meeting tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eleanor's house. Bringing contractors to mark pool placement on your acre. Don't tell David. They had meant to text someone else. My heart pounded. They weren't waiting until Tuesday. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I needed to be ready before they arrived. I woke before sunrise, gulping down coffee as I prepared. Jacobson arrived in an unmarked truck, equipment hidden under tarps. If we're right about those markers, he whispered as we worked in the dim light, the HOA survey missed nearly 2 acres of your land. Dew soaked my jeans as we hammered in flags exactly where Grandpa's deed indicated. With each stake, my confidence grew. The last marker went directly through the corner of Tyler and Samantha's fancy new deck. They built that deck last month, I told Jacobson. Convenient timing. Not just convenient, he replied, checking his GPS device. According to county permits, they built it after the HOA's new survey, almost like they knew where the new boundary would be. He handed me his tablet showing the official report. The HOA survey completely ignored the creek's original path before the 1978 flood. No professional would make that mistake accidentally. As the sun climbed higher, we heard vehicles approaching. Hide the equipment, I whispered. Let's see what they do. From behind my garden shed, we watched Eleanor arrive with 3 other board members and a landscaping crew. They unloaded spray paint and measuring tools, laughing as they marked out locations for cabanas, a tiki bar, and a massive pool, all on my property. This spa feature will be perfect right here, Eleanor said, marking a big X through my grandmother's rose garden that I'd maintained for 20 years. I wanted to confront them, but Jacobson held me back. Not yet. We need more. Later that morning, I visited the local historical society where my mom had volunteered. The director, Maria, greeted me warmly. Your timing is interesting, she said, pulling out a folder. Someone from the county just requested all records about your property. Eleanor Winters? Maria nodded. She seemed very interested in whether any historical claims had ever been filed. I explained my situation. Maria's expression darkened. This happened in Meadowbrook too. Their HOA president works for the same development company as Eleanor. She pulled out a newspaper article. They turned half the neighborhood into vacation rentals after forcing original owners out. Now I understood. This wasn't just about a community pool, it was about property values and development deals. I need proof of the archaeological significance Grandpa always talked about, I said. Maria smiled. Your grandfather actually donated some artifacts he found on your land. She brought out a small box containing arrowheads and pottery fragments. These were cataloged but never fully examined. I could arrange for an expert assessment. Back home, I found Rose in her garden across the street. They're marking up my land right now, I told her. I know, she said calmly. I've been taking pictures every hour. She showed me her phone. Documentation is key. That afternoon, I called Vince again. I need two things: the emergency historical preservation filing process and any information on Eleanor Winters' business connections. While waiting for Vince's call back, I noticed Tyler watching me from his yard. Hey neighbor, he called, too cheerfully. Excited about the new resort? I walked to the fence. Why did you build your deck after the HOA survey but before announcing the boundary changes? His smile faltered. What? The permit for your deck was filed one day after Eleanor's survey. Interesting coincidence. Look, we're just following the official property lines, he stuttered. The official lines include those 1952 markers I found this morning. One's right under your hot tub. Tyler's face drained of color. He muttered something about needing to make a call and hurried inside. Within minutes, my phone rang. Eleanor. David. Her voice was honey-sweet now. I hear you have concerns about the community project. Why don't you stop by and we can discuss them? I'd rather talk with everyone present. How about a special HOA meeting? That's not necessary. This is already decided. Then so is my next step, I replied. Are you threatening me? Her voice hardened. Just following proper procedures. Like documenting the original boundary markers your survey somehow missed. Silence. Then, what markers? The ones from 1952. Jacobson found them this morning. I could almost hear her mind racing. Those old things? They're not relevant to modern surveys. The county assessor's office disagrees. I just spoke with them. Another pause. We'll discuss this tomorrow. Meanwhile, stay off the common areas. You mean my property? I'll be using all of it, thanks. I hung up feeling stronger than I had in weeks. Vince called back immediately. You hit a nerve, he said. Eleanor just requested emergency access to all your property records. Too late for her? Way too late. I've already flagged your parcel with a preliminary historical review notice. Nothing can be developed while that's pending. That evening, I invited Rose and Jacobson over to plan our next steps. We spread maps across my kitchen table when headlights swept across the windows. Someone's here, Rose said, peeking through the curtains. It's Eleanor and the Morgans. Before I could respond, my phone pinged with messages from neighbors. Are you okay? Saw Eleanor heading to your place with the sheriff. Tyler's telling everyone you threatened him. Jacobson looked grim. They're escalating, trying to intimidate you. Let them try, I said, gathering our evidence into a folder. The doorbell rang, followed by aggressive knocking. I opened it to find Eleanor, Tyler, Samantha, and a man in uniform. Evening, folks, I said calmly. What brings you all here so late? Eleanor stepped forward. David, this is Deputy Wilson. We're concerned about your erratic behavior today. Tyler nodded vigorously. You threatened me in front of my family. My mouth fell open. That's completely false. Deputy Wilson looked uncomfortable. Sir, I understand there's a property dispute, but threatening neighbors. I never threatened anyone, I interrupted. In fact, I have witnesses to our conversation. I pointed to Rose's house where her security camera faced my yard. The deputy's expression changed. Is that so? Eleanor cut in smoothly. This isn't just about today. We're concerned about David's mental state. He's making wild claims about property lines that were settled years ago. I laughed despite myself. Settled? You just resurveyed them last month. Samantha spoke up. He's been obsessed with boundaries since we moved in, always watching us, complaining about noise. Because you built on my property and party until 1 a.m., I countered. The deputy raised his hands. Okay, slow down everyone. This sounds like a civil matter, not criminal. Eleanor wasn't giving up. He's been digging up the community land without permission, destroying landscaping. You mean my land? I opened the folder and handed the deputy copies of Jacobson's survey report, the original deed, and photos of the 1952 markers. These documents prove the HOA's survey is incorrect. They're trying to take nearly 2 acres of my legal property. The deputy reviewed the papers while Eleanor fumed silently. Ma'am, he finally said, this appears to be a legitimate property dispute that needs to be handled through proper channels, not police intervention. But, Eleanor started, unless there's evidence of actual threats or trespassing, I can't take action here. He handed the papers back to me. I suggest both parties contact their attorneys. As they turned to leave, I called out, Eleanor, one more thing. You might want to tell your friends at Lakeside Development that the county has initiated a historical preservation review of my property. Effective immediately. Eleanor froze mid-step, then spun around. How did you know about? She caught herself, but it was too late. The deputy looked between us, clearly sensing there was more to this story. Have a good night, I said pleasantly, closing my door on Eleanor's shocked face. Inside, Rose, Jacobson, and I exchanged looks of triumph, but we knew this was just the beginning. They'll come back with lawyers next, Jacobson warned. Let them, I replied, tapping the folder. We have truth on our side. Rose smiled slyly. And tomorrow we'll have even more. I've arranged for an archaeologist friend to examine those artifacts Maria found. My phone buzzed with a text from Vince. Found the connection. Eleanor's husband is CFO at Lakeside Development. They just filed plans for vacation rentals in your neighborhood. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about a resort pool. They wanted my land as part of a bigger commercial development. We need to warn the neighbors, I said. Already happening, Rose replied, showing me her phone where a neighborhood chat group was exploding with messages about Eleanor's development connections. A final text arrived from an unknown number. HOA emergency meeting called for 7 a.m. tomorrow. All board members required. Code red. Jacobson laughed. Looks like someone's panicking. I should have felt relieved, but something bothered me. They're not giving up this easily. Eleanor has too much invested. As if summoned by my words, the lights across my backyard suddenly blazed on. Massive construction lights mounted on the Morgans' property, aimed directly at my house. The glare was blinding, pouring through every window. What the? Jacobson started. Rose peered through the brightness. There's someone out there. By your shed. Squinting against the light, I could just make out figures moving on my property. They were removing my boundary flags. The rumble of heavy machinery jolted me awake at 4:30 a.m. I scrambled to my window and spotted a massive yellow bulldozer creeping toward my back acre. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, deed papers, and a flashlight before racing outside in my slippers. Stop right now, I shouted, waving my flashlight wildly. The bulldozer's headlights blinded me as it continued forward, its metal blade gleaming in the pre-dawn darkness. The operator, a confused-looking man in a hard hat, finally cut the engine. Look, buddy, I'm just following orders. Got paperwork right here saying this is HOA property. Well, your paperwork is wrong, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. My grandfather's warnings about staying vigilant about our property lines echoed in my mind. Headlights swept across my yard as 3 vehicles pulled up. Eleanor stepped out of her white Range Rover wearing a tailored pantsuit despite the early hour, followed by the Morgans and 2 men I didn't recognize carrying briefcases. Mr. Jackson, Eleanor called out with a tight smile. I see you're an early riser too. Wonderful. You can watch the groundbreaking ceremony. I held up my phone. I've already called Sheriff Davis. He's on his way. You're trespassing on private property. Actually, Eleanor replied, unfolding a document from her leather portfolio. According to the county survey we commissioned, this land falls within community boundaries. We're being quite generous with the compensation package. Tyler Morgan snickered behind her. Time to join the team, Jackson. The resort will boost all our property values. I stood my ground, feeling the damp grass between my toes. I filed an emergency injunction yesterday. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I have the original survey markers to prove it. Eleanor's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly. An injunction? How inconvenient. She turned to one of the suited men. Harold, call Judge Watkins. Wake him if necessary. The distant wail of a police siren cut through the tension. Sheriff Davis, my father's old fishing buddy, pulled up in his patrol car, looking irritated. What's going on here? He asked, adjusting his belt as he approached. Eleanor stepped forward with an outstretched hand. Good morning, Sheriff. Small misunderstanding about property lines. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about? I echoed, my voice rising. They're trying to steal my land. Sheriff Davis looked between us. Ma'am, do you have permits for this machinery to operate before 7 a.m.? And construction permits for whatever you're planning? Eleanor's smile faltered. We have HOA authorization. That's not what I asked. Sheriff Davis interrupted. County ordinance says no construction before 7 a.m. in residential areas. And I don't see any permits displayed. While they argued, I noticed Rose, my 78-year-old neighbor, walking toward us with a stack of yellowed papers. She had been on the original HOA board 30 years ago before retiring. Eleanor? Rose called out, her voice stronger than her frail frame suggested. You might want to see these before you make a terrible mistake. Eleanor dismissed her with a wave. Not now, Rose. Rose ignored her, handing me the papers instead. Your grandfather and I prepared for something like this years ago. The HOA tried this same tactic in '89 with the Henderson property. I skimmed the documents. Original meeting minutes showing the true boundaries had been officially recorded with the state, not just the county. Sheriff, I said, I'd like to file harassment charges, and I want these people and their equipment off my property immediately. Eleanor's phone buzzed. She stepped away to answer it, her face darkening as she listened. When she returned, her voice had lost its edge. There appears to be a paperwork conflict, she announced to her group. We'll postpone today's work to sort out these technicalities. The bulldozer operator looked relieved as he climbed down from his machine. So, no work today? Pack it up, Eleanor snapped. As they reluctantly retreated, I noticed several neighbors had gathered at the edge of my property, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording everything. Eleanor noticed too. Her eyes narrowed as she walked to her car. This isn't over, Jackson. The board votes tomorrow on invoking our emergency powers clause. I suggest you prepare a reasonable counteroffer before then. Sheriff Davis waited until they drove away before turning to me. Your dad always said the HOA would try something like this after he passed. You holding up okay? I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of fighting this battle alone. I'll be fine, but I need to prepare for tomorrow. Rose patted my arm. You're not alone, dear. Some of us remember how this community started, before people like Eleanor tried to turn it into their personal country club. As we stood in my yard watching the sunrise, my phone dinged with a text from Jacobson. Found something big in the county archives. Meet me at 9. Bring coffee. Lots of it. I looked up at my neighbors still lingering at the edge of my property. Some gave encouraging waves, while others turned away awkwardly. The battle lines were being drawn, and tomorrow's vote would test exactly who stood where. You can't go in there. Eleanor's assistant tried to block my path as I pushed through the double doors of Maple Ridge Community Center. The emergency HOA meeting had started 20 minutes early, another of Eleanor's tricks. Actually, I can, I replied, clutching my leather briefcase. Inside were the fruits of my all-night research session with Jacobson, documents that would change everything. Heads turned as I marched down the center aisle. The room was packed with over 100 neighbors, some I'd known for decades, Others recent arrivals drawn by Eleanor's promises of a resort-style community upgrade. Eleanor stood at the podium mid-sentence, her crimson lipstick matching her blazer. As I was saying before the interruption, the vote to invoke our Community Enhancement Clause requires a 2/3 majority. Before anyone votes, I announced loudly, "You should know what you're actually voting on." Eleanor's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the microphone. "Mr. Jackson, you're out of order. We're following Robert's rules here." "Funny you mention rules," I said, opening my briefcase, "because I've spent the night discovering just how many you've broken." Whispers rippled through the crowd. I spotted the Morgans in the front row, Tyler nervously adjusting his collar. 3 rows back, Rose gave me an encouraging nod. "Point of order," called Harold, Eleanor's lawyer friend. "The agenda doesn't allow for." "The agenda was changed without proper notice," I countered. "Section 5 of your own bylaws requires 72 hours for emergency meeting notifications with no changes permitted after distribution." Harold's mouth snapped shut as several neighbors murmured in agreement. I approached the front table where the board sat. "I request 10 minutes to present relevant information before any vote occurs." Board member Diana Chun, who'd always been fair despite her friendship with Eleanor, spoke up. "I move we allow Mr. Jackson to speak." "Seconded," called several voices. Eleanor's face tightened, but she stepped aside. "Very well. 10 minutes." I laid out 3 large maps on the presentation table. This first document is the original 1952 survey of Maple Ridge, showing the natural creek boundary that defined my family's property. I pointed to the winding blue line. The creek formed a natural border between private and community land, but during the flood of '78, the creek shifted. "Ancient history," Eleanor interrupted. "Our recent survey." "Your survey," I continued calmly, "conveniently ignores the original boundary markers, which state law maintains as the legal definition even when natural features change." I unveiled Jacobson's new certified survey with red boundary lines extending far beyond what the HOA claimed. "According to state law and county records, my property includes all of this area, which, unfortunately for some of you, includes land you thought was yours." Gasps erupted as neighbors recognized the implications. "That's impossible," Tyler Morgan sputtered, his face going pale. "Unfortunately not," I replied. "Your swimming pool extends 12 feet onto my legal property. And Eleanor's home addition from last spring? It's 18 feet over the line." All eyes turned to Eleanor, whose composed facade cracked for the first time. "This is absurd. Our survey was conducted by your brother-in-law's company," I finished for her. "A clear conflict of interest, which I've outlined in this ethics complaint filed with the state licensing board this morning." I handed copies to each board member. "But there's something even more significant." From my briefcase, I carefully removed a plastic bag containing what looked like stone arrowheads. During our legitimate survey yesterday, we discovered these artifacts, which the county archaeologist has preliminarily identified as dating back approximately 800 years. The room went completely silent. "I've already filed for historical preservation status," I explained, "which means no development can occur within 200 feet of the discovery site, effectively covering my entire property." Rose stood from her seat, walking slowly to the front. "I was there when these were uncovered. As an amateur archaeologist, I recognized their significance immediately." Eleanor's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. She shoved him away. "This is a delay tactic," she hissed. "We have investors waiting, contracts signed." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Diana Chun leaned forward. "What investors, Eleanor? The board hasn't approved any contracts." Eleanor's mistake registered on her face too late. The room erupted in questions. "Order! Order!" Eleanor shouted, banging her gavel so hard the head broke off. I wasn't finished. While researching property records, I discovered something else interesting. I held up a document with highlighted sections. 3 months ago, Eleanor and her husband created an LLC called Ridgeline Development Partners. 2 weeks later, This LLC purchased the vacant lot next to my property, which would significantly increase in value if a resort facility were built adjacent to it. Board member Frank Thompson's eyes widened. You told us you sold that property to your cousin. This is character assassination, Eleanor snarled. No, I replied calmly. It's public record. Diana Chin stood up. I move we adjourn this meeting and suspend all actions regarding the proposed development until a full investigation of these allegations can be completed. Seconded, called several voices. You can't do this. Eleanor's voice rose dangerously. We have deadlines. What deadlines? Asked Frank. And what contracts are you talking about? As the board members turned on each other, I noticed Tyler Morgan slipping out a side door, phone pressed to his ear. Eleanor saw me watching him leave and something cold entered her eyes. This isn't over, Jackson. Not by a long shot. Diana approached me as the meeting dissolved into chaos. You should know that Eleanor's been talking to city officials about rezoning this entire area. Whatever game she's playing, it's bigger than just your property. I nodded, suddenly understanding why Eleanor had been so aggressive. Thank you for the warning. As neighbors crowded around me with questions, my phone vibrated with a text from Jacobson. Don't celebrate yet. Found building permits filed under different company name. They're going after Rose's property next. Meet me at county office ASAP. I looked across the room where Eleanor huddled with Harold and two board members. Despite the setback, she wore a slight smile. Whatever she had planned, I realized this battle was far from over. Get off my property, I shouted as Eleanor's fancy car pulled into my driveway, kicking up gravel. The entire HOA board spilled out like angry hornets from a disturbed nest. My heart pounded, but I planted my feet firmly on my porch steps. We need to talk, Eleanor said, her voice icier than winter. She clutched a leather folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. Your little stunt at the meeting has forced us to involve our attorneys. Behind her stood a nervous man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch. Mr. Peterson, HOA legal counsel, he mumbled, barely looking at me. I crossed my arms. Funny, I was about to call my lawyer too, and the county assessor, and maybe the local news station. Eleanor's face twitched. The other board members exchanged worried glances. Perhaps we could discuss this inside? Peterson suggested, his voice cracking slightly. I shook my head. We can talk right here where the neighbors can see us. I'm done with secret meetings and backroom deals. Mrs. Garcia from next door happened to be watering her flowers, clearly eavesdropping. Rose had positioned her lawn chair on her front porch with a clear view of my yard. Even old Mr. Jenkins had his window open, his hearing aid turned up high. Peterson cleared his throat. We've reviewed your documentation. The board is prepared to make a reasonable offer. Which is? I asked, raising an eyebrow. We drop all claims to your property, Eleanor said through clenched teeth. In exchange, you waive any claims against the structures currently on your land. I laughed. You mean your illegal home addition and the Morgan's pool that crosses my property line by 8 feet? That's your big offer. It's more than fair, board member Keith insisted, his face reddening. What about the bulldozer that nearly destroyed my garden? The noise violations? The threats? The lies to the community about my land? Peterson stepped forward, lowering his voice. Be reasonable. We could tie this up in court for years. You could try, I replied, pulling out my phone. But I recorded Eleanor giving orders to start construction before the approved date. And I have statements from 3 contractors saying they were told to ignore property markers. Eleanor lunged forward. You can't prove. And I have copies of the emails where you discussed how to pressure me into selling. I continued, watching her face pale. My cousin in county records found those quite interesting. Did you know improperly filed HOA documents become public record after 7 years? The tension in the air felt thick enough to cut. Peterson whispered urgently to Eleanor, whose perfectly styled hair seemed to droop with each passing second. What do you want? She finally asked, defeat creeping into her voice. I'd been waiting for this question. First, a binding agreement with severe penalties if broken. The leisure center gets built on the actual common land by the front entrance. Second, revised noise rules with real enforcement. Third, you make a public apology at the next meeting. Tyler, who had been hovering behind the group, pushed forward. That's ridiculous. You can't make demands like, I'm not finished, I interrupted calmly. Fourth, I want a position on the Architectural Review Committee. And finally, a fund set up for property line verification for every home in the neighborhood, paid for by the HOA reserves. Impossible, Eleanor exploded. We'd have to raise dues. Or cut your executive compensation, I suggested with a smile. Your choice. The group huddled together, whispering frantically. Peterson kept shaking his head while Eleanor jabbed her finger at my house. Mrs. Garcia had abandoned all pretense of gardening and was now openly watching. Rose gave me a thumbs up from her porch. After what felt like forever, Eleanor marched back, her designer heels sinking into my lawn. Fine, she spat, extending her hand. But this agreement includes a non-disclosure clause. No one hears about what happened here. I shook her cold hand firmly. Too late for that. The neighbors have already heard everything. As they shuffled back to their cars, defeated and muttering, I overheard board member Keith whisper to Eleanor, Why did we agree to all this? Eleanor hissed back. Because he didn't mention the tax reassessment that would happen if he reported the correct property lines to the county. We'd all be ruined. I smiled to myself. I hadn't even thought of that angle. Sometimes the best victories come from letting your enemies imagine their own worst fears. The battle was won, but something told me the war wasn't over. Eleanor's eyes held a promise of revenge as she drove away. What was she planning next? My hands shook as I unfolded the certified letter. 6 months after our showdown, Eleanor had disappeared from public view, but rumors swirled through the neighborhood like autumn leaves. Some said she was gathering evidence against me. Others claimed she'd hired private investigators. The whispers kept me awake at night. The HOA meeting was scheduled for tonight. Would she make her move then? I scanned the official letterhead and gasped. The county tax assessor had completed their review of all Pinecrest Village properties based on the new surveys. Eleanor's property value had increased by 40% due to the undisclosed improvements crossing onto my land. The Morgans faced similar increases. My own taxes remained unchanged thanks to the historical designation Jacobson had helped me secure. My doorbell rang, startling me. Through the peephole, I saw Tyler Morgan standing alone, shifting his weight nervously. What do you want? I asked, opening the door just enough to speak. Can we talk? He looked different, humbler somehow. I brought something you should see. Cautiously, I let him in. He placed a USB drive on my coffee table. Eleanor's been planning something big, he explained, his voice low. After you forced her to apologize, she became obsessed with getting even. She convinced half the board to support her secret project. I picked up the drive. What's this? Everything. Emails, plans, fake evidence she created to discredit your property claims. He looked ashamed. Samantha and I were part of it until we saw how far she was willing to go. Why turn on her now? I asked suspiciously. Tyler sighed. The tax reassessment hit us hard. When I asked Eleanor for help, she laughed and said we were acceptable collateral damage in her war against you. His eyes met mine. We have kids heading to college soon. We can't afford her revenge games. The HOA meeting room buzzed with tension that evening. Attendance was higher than usual. Word had spread that something big would happen. I spotted the Morgans sitting far from Eleanor, who glared at them venomously. Rose banged her gavel, now serving as interim president. Before we begin normal business, I understand Mrs. Winters has an announcement. Eleanor strutted to the podium, triumph glittering in her eyes. After months of investigation, I've uncovered evidence that will shock this community. She pulled out a folder. The property survey that caused so much trouble? It was based on fraudulent documentation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. My heart raced. I move that we immediately reverse all decisions based on these false claims and pursue legal action against Point of order, I called out, standing. Before voting on any motion, I believe the board should review this evidence that just came to light today. I connected Tyler's USB drive to the projector. Eleanor's face drained of color as her own emails appeared on screen, revealing her plot to fabricate evidence against me. That's not real, she stammered. It came from your own computer, Eleanor, Tyler said, standing beside his wife. We've provided sworn statements about how you asked us to help create fake documents. The room erupted. Board members shouted questions. Homeowners demanded answers. Through the chaos, I noticed Peterson, the HOA attorney, quietly slipping out the back door. Rose pounded her gavel repeatedly. Order. As acting president, I move that we immediately suspend Mrs. Winters from the board pending investigation. The vote was unanimous, except for Eleanor, who sat frozen in her chair. As people filed out afterward, neighbors who had once avoided me stopped to chat. Mrs. Garcia brought homemade cookies. Old Mr. Jenkins clapped my shoulder. You stood up for all of us, he said gruffly. These fancy newcomers forget what community really means. 2 weeks later, a construction crew broke ground on the new leisure center on the proper community land near the entrance, exactly as I'd suggested. The updated noise ordinances had transformed our once rowdy neighborhood into a peaceful haven. Eleanor had quietly listed her house for sale. A knock at my door revealed Rose with a bottle of champagne and official-looking papers. The board voted unanimously, she announced proudly. You're now chairman of both the Architectural Review Committee and the newly created Property Rights Committee. We sat on my porch watching the sunset, glasses raised. I never wanted a fight, I admitted. I just wanted what was rightfully mine. Rose nodded. Sometimes the best trap isn't set with anger but with patience. You gave Eleanor enough rope, and she hanged herself. As twilight settled over my land that would stay in my family for generations thanks to its new protected status, my phone buzzed with a message from Vince. University experts finished testing. Those artifacts Jacobson found? They're not just real, they're rare. State Historical Society wants to talk about a preservation grant. I laughed out loud. Grandfather always told me this land was special, but even he couldn't have guessed how valuable it would become, not in dollars, but in community. The HOA had taken my bait perfectly, rushing to grab what they thought was easy pickings, never suspecting I'd laid a trap that would protect this place forever. The sweetest victories aren't won through force but through wisdom, and sometimes justice arrives in unexpected packages, wrapped in preservation orders that not even the most determined HOA can override.